My name is Morgan Wells, 38 years old, and I used to have it all: a successful career in corporate law, a $3.5 million mansion in Westchester County, and two beautiful children, Emma, 12, and Nathan, 9. Until my husband, Richard, a high-powered investment banker, blindsided me with divorce papers and a custody battle that stripped me of everything I held dear. What I never expected was how a single dusty envelope, hidden in my late mother's attic for decades, would turn the tables in my favor. Before I dive into this roller coaster of betrayal and redemption, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about justice served when all hope seems lost. I met Richard Blackwell during our second year at Harvard Law. He was charismatic, brilliant, and ambitious, qualities I both admired and shared. We were competitive in class but companions outside it, our relationship evolving from study partners to lovers over late-night case preparations. When he proposed on graduation day, I said yes without hesitation. We were going to conquer the legal world together. At least, that was the plan. After 5 years at the same prestigious New York law firm, I was on track to make partner when I became pregnant with Emma. Richard had already transitioned from law to investment banking, where his analytical mind and persuasive abilities earned him a fortune. We agreed I would step back temporarily, just until Emma started school. But one child became two when Nathan arrived 3 years later, and somehow temporary became indefinite. "Your career will always be there," Richard would say. "These years with the kids are precious and irreplaceable." His logic was sound, and his income more than compensated for mine. So I became the supporting character in Richard's success story, the perfect corporate wife who managed our domestic empire while he conquered Wall Street. And what an empire it was. Our home in Westchester spanned nearly 8,000 square feet on 3 manicured acres. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, a home theater, wine cellar, indoor pool, and a 3-car garage housing vehicles worth more than most people's homes. The grand staircase in our foyer was where we took family Christmas photos, Emma and Nathan growing taller each year, Richard and I beaming behind them. Emma's bedroom was a musician's dream, with acoustic paneling and space for her beloved grand piano, a gift from Richard on her 10th birthday after she showed exceptional talent. Nathan's room featured a custom mural of a soccer field, his trophies proudly displayed on floating shelves. The kitchen was my domain, with marble countertops where I'd help the children with homework while preparing meals that rarely received more than a cursory taste from Richard, who was perpetually just leaving or just arriving. We hosted summer garden parties where Richard charmed potential clients, charity galas where we donated substantial checks with minimal fanfare, and intimate dinners with judges, politicians, and industry leaders who could advance Richard's increasingly ambitious goals. I organized it all flawlessly, maintained meaningful relationships with the right people, and ensured our children received the perfect balance of privilege and values. When I look back now, I recognize the warning signs that appeared long before the divorce papers. The way Richard would check his phone during Emma's violin recitals. How he started missing Nathan's soccer games despite promising to be there. The business trips that grew more frequent and longer. The late-night calls he would take in his study, speaking in hushed tones. The subtle way he began criticizing my appearance, suggesting new workout regimens or wardrobes that would help me keep up with the other wives. But I dismissed these concerns, attributing them to the pressure Richard faced at work. When you're living inside a fairy tale, you find ways to justify the cracks in the castle walls. My mother, Catherine Wells, was my reality check. A practical, no-nonsense woman who had raised me alone after my father died when I was young, she never fully warmed to Richard despite his charm offensive. "He looks at you like you're an acquisition, not a partner," she once said, promptly apologizing when she saw my hurt expression. I defended Richard vehemently, listing his virtues and reminding her of our beautiful life together. When she died 6 months before everything fell apart, I lost more than a mother. I lost the one person who might have prepared me for what was coming. Catherine left me her modest home in Queens and a lifetime of memories I was too busy to properly sort through. Between managing the children's activities, maintaining our social calendar, and grieving my mother, I put off clearing out her house, telling myself I would get to it when things settled down. things never settled down. Instead, they completely fell apart. Looking back, I realize Richard had been laying groundwork for months, perhaps years. Casual comments to friends about how worried he was about my emotional state since my mother died. Discussions with the children's teachers about my inconsistent involvement in their education, despite the fact that I attended every conference and volunteered at every opportunity. Gradual transfers of our assets that I signed off on without proper scrutiny, trusting his financial expertise. I believed we were partners. I never imagined I was being systematically erased from my own life. It was a Tuesday evening in April when Richard came home earlier than usual. I remember feeling a flutter of hope that maybe he was finally prioritizing family time again. Emma was practicing violin upstairs, Nathan was finishing homework at the kitchen island, and I was putting the final touches on a roasted chicken dinner that would ultimately go uneaten. Richard didn't remove his coat or set down his briefcase. He stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the grand foyer, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice clinically detached. "Privately." I wiped my hands on a dish towel, asked Nathan to keep an eye on the oven, and followed Richard to his study. The heavy door had barely closed when he handed me a thick manila envelope. "I filed for divorce," he announced, as if reporting quarterly earnings. "My attorney advised me to inform you that you'll be served officially tomorrow. This is just a courtesy copy." The world tilted sideways. "Is this a joke?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I've outlined a generous settlement offer," he continued, ignoring my question. "Given the circumstances, it's more than fair." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope and began reading. The clinical language swam before my eyes, but certain phrases stood out with horrific clarity: irreconcilable differences, primary physical custody, supervised visitation, and most shockingly, psychological evaluation recommended. Psychological evaluation? "Richard, what is this?" His face remained impassive. "Morgan, we both know you haven't been stable since your mother died. The drinking, the emotional outbursts, the neglect of the children. What are you talking about?" I interrupted, genuinely bewildered. "I've never neglected our children." "And what drinking?" "I barely finish a glass of wine with dinner." He sighed, the picture of pained concern. "This is exactly the kind of denial the therapist mentioned. You need help, Morgan, and I've tried to provide it. But my priority has to be protecting Emma and Nathan." In that moment, looking at this stranger wearing my husband's face, I realized I was in serious trouble. This wasn't a spontaneous decision or a midlife crisis. This was calculated. Planned. And I was completely unprepared. The next morning, I called Grace Sullivan, a former colleague who specialized in family law. She agreed to meet immediately, reviewing the papers with increasing concern as I explained the situation. "These allegations are serious, Morgan," she said, her brow furrowed. "And frankly, bizarre given what you're telling me. Has Richard ever expressed these concerns before?" "Never," I insisted. "We've had normal disagreements about parenting, but he's never suggested I was unstable or neglectful. This is coming out of nowhere." Grace's expression was grim. "It's not coming out of nowhere. This level of detail and documentation suggests he's been building this case for some time." She was right. As the proceedings unfolded, Richard's legal team produced a damning collection of evidence: photos of empty wine bottles in our recycling bin, purchased for dinner parties, not personal consumption, text messages to Richard complaining about the children's behavior taken completely out of context, testimony from our housekeeper about my emotional episodes, normal grief after my mother's death, and most disturbingly, a journal allegedly documenting my increasingly erratic behavior. That Richard claimed to have kept out of concern. I didn't recognize the woman described in those pages. She was paranoid, volatile, frequently intoxicated, and resentful of her own children. She was a fabrication, a character created to justify Richard's actions. Meanwhile, our joint accounts were suddenly inaccessible. Credit cards declined when I tried to buy groceries. The Range Rover I drove disappeared from the garage, reported stolen when I called the police, then revealed to be reclaimed as it was technically in Richard's name. During our second court appearance, I learned Richard had been having an affair with his executive assistant, Brooke Madison, a willowy 26-year-old who now sat behind him in court, her expression a mixture of sympathy and triumph. When Grace brought this to the judge's attention, Richard's attorney smoothly countered that while regrettable, the relationship had only begun after Richard recognized the marriage was beyond repair, and was irrelevant to custody considerations. The judge, Harold Winters, seemed to accept this explanation without question. In fact, Judge Winters seemed predisposed to accept everything Richard's team presented while scrutinizing our evidence with skeptical disdain. His temporary ruling granted Richard primary custody, with supervised visitation for me pending psychological evaluation. I was also ordered to vacate our home within 72 hours. "This is just temporary," Grace assured me as I sobbed in her office afterward. "We'll gather counter-evidence, find witnesses to your actual relationship with the children. The psychological evaluation will clear you. This is a setback, not the end." But it felt like the end as I packed up personal items under the watchful eye of a court-appointed observer. Emma and Nathan were confused and frightened, clearly having been told only Richard's version of events. "Are you sick, Mom?" Emma asked, hovering in the doorway of my closet as I folded sweaters with trembling hands. "No, sweetheart, I'm not sick," I replied, fighting back tears. "Dad and I have some grown-up things to work out. I'll still see you, just not here for a while." "Dad says you need special doctors to make you better," Nathan said, his voice small. "He says we have to be careful around you." The injury of those words cut deeper than anything the court had done. Richard wasn't just taking my home and restricting my access to my children, he was poisoning their perception of me. I moved into a sterile one-bedroom apartment that cost nearly my entire monthly allowance from the court. The walls were thin, the furniture second-hand, the neighborhood unfamiliar. On my first supervised visit with the children, they seemed like nervous strangers, checking with the court-appointed supervisor before answering my questions, flinching slightly when I moved to hug them. Meanwhile, Richard's campaign continued. Our mutual friend stopped returning my calls, clearly having heard only his version of events. My former in-laws, who had once treated me like a daughter, now avoided me entirely. Even parents from the children's school, people I'd coordinated fundraisers and chaperoned field trips with, now regarded me with polite distance when I attended school functions, always under supervision. During one supervised exchange, Richard pulled me aside, his voice low and threatening. "You should have stayed in your place, Morgan. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? Fighting a losing battle? Now you'll have nothing. Why are you doing this?" I asked, searching his face for any trace of the man I thought I'd married. "What happened to you?" "To us?" His smile was cold. "There was never an US, Morgan. There was what I needed, and you provided it. Now I need something else." That's when I realized the truth, Richard hadn't changed. He had always been this person. I just hadn't wanted to see it. The second court hearing was worse than the first. Richard's team had somehow obtained records from 3 different therapists I'd allegedly consulted over the past 2 years, therapists I had never met. The detailed session notes described increasing paranoia, alcohol dependency, and resentment toward my children for trapping me in domestic life. "Your Honor, my client has never seen these therapists," Grace objected. "These records are fabricated." Judge Winters peered at me over his glasses. "Are you suggesting, Ms. Sullivan, that these licensed professionals are committing perjury and fraud by submitting false medical records to this court?" "I'm suggesting these records should be authenticated through proper channels," Grace countered. "Anyone could create these documents. We request time to investigate their authenticity." "The court finds these objections obstructionist," Judge Winters replied. "The evidence will be admitted." Outside the courtroom, Grace was furious. "Something's not right. Winters is practically acting as co-counsel for Richard. We need to look into his connections." A week later, Angela Ramirez, our longtime housekeeper, called me from a blocked number. "Mrs. Wells, I wanted to tell you," she began, her voice trembling. "Mr. Blackwell, he tell me what to say to the court. He say if I don't, he report my sister to immigration. But what I said about you, it's not true." Hope flared. "Angela, would you be willing to?" "I can't," she interrupted. "I'm sorry. I just wanted you to know." She hung up before I could respond. When I told Grace about the call, she tried to track Angela down, but the housekeeper had apparently left the state to visit family. Another dead end. Meanwhile, through Emma's innocent comments during a supervised visit, I learned that Richard was planning to take the children to Switzerland for the summer, and possibly enroll them in school there. When Grace filed an emergency motion to prevent them from leaving the country, Richard's team produced documentation of a long-planned educational opportunity that I had supposedly agreed to months ago. My alleged signature was on the permission forms. Another fabrication, but one that looked convincingly real. By now, I was running out of money. Grace had reduced her fees, but legal battles are expensive, and Richard controlled all our assets. I took a paralegal position at a small firm, the only legal work I could find after nearly a decade away from practice and with my reputation in tatters. The hours were long, the pay minimal, and it further restricted the time I could spend on my case or with my children. My lowest point came after I discovered evidence that Richard had bribed the court-appointed psychologist evaluating me. Desperate and out of options, I went to his office building, hoping to confront him with what I'd found. I never made it past the lobby. Security stopped me, and by the next day, Richard had obtained a restraining order, claiming I had threatened him and Brooke. The court further restricted my visitation rights, now limited to once a week in a sterile family services facility. "He's connected to Judge Winters," Grace told me during a late-night strategy session in her office. "We've traced campaign donations through various shell companies. It's well disguised, but it's there. We can file for a recusal, but without solid proof, we risk antagonizing the court further." The final devastating blow came 3 months into the battle. Judge Winters ruled in Richard's favor on all counts: full legal and physical custody of the children, ownership of the house and nearly all assets, and minimal spousal support that barely covered my rent. My visitation would remain supervised indefinitely, pending significant improvement in my psychological state, as determined by the same compromised evaluators. "We'll appeal," Grace promised, though her voice lacked conviction. "But Morgan, I need to be honest, Richard has resources we can't match. He's thought of everything." That night, alone in my apartment, I hit rock bottom. The walls of the tiny bedroom closed in as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my phone. It was family movie night, or would have been, in my previous life. I scrolled through old photos, Emma laughing as she built a sandcastle during our trip to the Hamptons, Nathan missing his front teeth as he proudly held up a soccer trophy, the 4 of us in coordinating outfits for our last Christmas card. A text notification interrupted my misery. Richard had sent a photo, Emma and Nathan curled up on our living room sofa with Brooke between them, all 3 smiling at the camera. Movie night, continuing without me. Below the image, his message: "The kids are doing so much better now. Stability makes all the difference." I threw the phone across the room, where it left a small dent in the drywall before clattering to the floor. 2 days later, I encountered Brooke outside the children's school after a parent-teacher conference I had fought to attend. She was driving my Range Rover, wearing designer sunglasses that looked suspiciously like ones from my collection. "Morgan," she acknowledged with faux sympathy. "Richard mentioned you might be here. How are you holding up?" The casual cruelty of the question left me speechless. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You know, you really should consider signing those final papers Richard sent over. Fighting this is just prolonging the inevitable. He always gets what he wants." "Why?" I finally managed. "Why me? Why my family?" Brooke's perfect features arranged themselves into a puzzled expression. "Oh honey, it was never about you. You were just convenient. Right place, right time." She glanced at her watch, my watch, actually, a Cartier that had been an anniversary gift. I should get the kids to their activities. Take care of yourself, Morgan. As she drove away in my car, wearing my watch and my sunglasses, on her way to my children and my home, something inside me finally broke. I had been fighting to reclaim a life that seemed increasingly like a mirage. Richard had orchestrated my destruction with meticulous precision, and I had no more moves left. The next day, Richard's attorneys contacted Grace with an offer. If I would sign away my parental rights entirely, Richard would provide a lump sum payment that would allow me to start fresh somewhere else. Grace advised against it, of course, but the hopelessness of our situation hung between us unspoken. I took the papers home to my apartment, where they sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days while I moved through life like a ghost. Each night, I would sit at the counter, pen in hand, staring at the signature line, wondering if surrender might actually bring relief. On the 4th night, instead of signing, I made a different decision. If I couldn't save my present, perhaps I could finally face my past. It was time to clear out my mother's house, the last task I had been avoiding since her death. Little did I know that decision would change Eve. The key stuck in the lock of my mother's front door, just as it had the handful of times I'd visited since her funeral. The modest 2-bedroom house in Queens was a world away from my Westchester mansion, but it had been home for most of my childhood. I jiggled the key, applied my hip to the door's warped frame, and pushed my way inside. The musty scent of an unlived-in house greeted me. Dust particles danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Everything remained exactly as my mother had left it, her reading glasses on the side table next to her favorite armchair, a half-completed crossword puzzle nearby, her cardigan draped over the back of a kitchen chair. I'd been avoiding this. Avoiding her absence, avoiding the finality of sorting through her belongings. But now, with my own life in shambles, facing my mother's death seemed almost secondary. What was one more loss in a season of complete devastation? I started small, sorting through kitchen drawers, making piles for donation, trash, and the few items I might want to keep. My mother had never been sentimental about possessions, often telling me, "Things are just things, Morgan. It's the people who matter." The irony of that lesson wasn't lost on me now, as I'd lost the people and was left with only things. By evening, I'd cleared the kitchen and most of the living room. I ordered delivery from the neighborhood Chinese restaurant my mother and I had frequented, eating directly from the carton as I sat on her living room floor surrounded by cardboard boxes. The familiar taste brought tears to my eyes, tears for my mother, for my children, for the life I'd lost, and for the woman I'd been before all this began. After dinner, I steeled myself to tackle her bedroom. Her scent still lingered faintly in the closet as I methodically removed dresses, sweaters, and shoes, each item a memory. At the back of the closet, I found a narrow pull-down staircase leading to the attic, a space I'd rarely entered even as a child. The attic was stifling, the summer heat concentrated under the eaves. A single bare bulb provided meager light as I surveyed decades of stored memories. Old furniture, holiday decorations, photo albums, and dozens of cardboard boxes lined the rafters. Many were labeled in my mother's neat handwriting: Morgan, school papers, family photos, 1980s, Catherine's college days. One box, shoved into a corner and covered with a film of dust, caught my attention. Unlike the others, it bore a label that seemed almost like a warning: insurance, never throw away. Curious, I pulled it toward me, sneezing as dust tickled my nose. Inside were folders of homeowners' insurance policies, warranties for appliances long since replaced, and my mother's will. But beneath these expected documents was a yellowed envelope addressed simply to Catherine Wells in handwriting I didn't recognize. The envelope's seal had been broken, its contents clearly examined many times based on the worn creases in the papers inside. I carefully removed a stack of photographs, handwritten letters, and what appeared to be a small recording device, the kind journalists once used for interviews, now obsolete technology. The photos showed my mother, much younger, perhaps in her early 30s, standing beside a man whose face was hauntingly familiar. With a shock of recognition, I realized I was looking at Richard, a younger version, but unmistakably him, with his arm around my mother. The photo was dated nearly 5 years before Richard and I supposedly met at Harvard. My hands trembling, I unfolded the first letter. It was from Richard to my mother, dated 15 years ago. "Catherine," it began. "I understand your reluctance, but surely you see the poetry in this arrangement. Your daughter is the perfect vehicle for our purposes. James agrees that this approach minimizes our exposure while maximizing potential return. Once I've established the appropriate relationship with Morgan, the Wells family fortune will finally be where it belongs. Consider this appropriate compensation for what your father did to mine." I read the letter 3 times, struggling to comprehend its implications. What arrangement? What fortune? My grandfather had been a pharmacist who owned a small local drugstore. We had never been wealthy. I moved to the next letter, this one dated shortly after Richard and I began dating. Phase 1 complete, it read. "Morgan is exactly as you described, brilliant but naive, ambitious yet desperate for approval. She believes our meeting was serendipitous. By the time I propose, she'll have relinquished any suspicion. James has prepared the necessary documentation for the next phase. As agreed, your involvement remains our secret." The room seemed to spin around me. These weren't love letters between former lovers, they were progress reports in some kind of operation. And my mother had been involved? It made no sense. With shaking fingers, I pressed play on the recording device, praying its batteries hadn't corroded. After several seconds of static, voices emerged, Richard's unmistakable baritone, and another male voice I didn't recognize. "The Wells girl doesn't suspect anything?" the unknown man asked. "Morgan is completely in the dark," Richard replied, his tone smug. "She thinks Harvard was our first meeting. Catherine has played her part perfectly, pretending to dislike me while feeding me every detail I need." "And the grandfather's company? You've located the records?" "Not yet. Catherine insists her father liquidated everything after the lawsuit. But there must be assets hidden somewhere. No pharmaceutical company settles a class action for that amount without insurance policies, subsidiary holdings, or offshore accounts. Morgan is our key to finding it all. And if she doesn't lead us to it?" Richard's laugh was cold. "Then I'm married to an attractive, accomplished woman from a good family who will bear my children and advance my social standing. She's already talking about stepping back from her career when we start a family. I win either way. But once we find those assets, we'll implement the extraction plan. Catherine will finally get her revenge, and we'll get paid. Making Catherine pay for what her father did, using her own daughter, that's cold, Richard. Brilliant, but cold. Business is business, James. Catherine wants vengeance for her disinheritance. I want the money her father hid from my father. Morgan is simply the means to both ends." The recording continued, detailing more of their scheme, but I was already pulling out the remaining contents of the box. At the bottom, I found my mother's leather-bound journal and a USB drive labeled simply RB Evidence. The journal entries began shortly after Richard and I started dating and continued until just days before my mother's death. In her familiar handwriting, my mother documented her growing horror at what she had set in motion. "I've made a terrible mistake," one entry read. "I was so blinded by bitterness toward father that I never considered the consequences. Morgan loves him. She truly loves this monster I've invited into her life. And he's using her exactly as he promised he would. I thought I wanted this, but watching my daughter's heart being manipulated by this sociopath, I can't bear it. I have to stop this somehow." Later entries detailed her efforts to gather evidence against Richard, tracking his financial maneuvers, recording conversations when possible, and compiling documentation of his true business dealings, many of which were apparently fraudulent. The final entry, dated just 3 days before her fatal heart attack, was the most chilling. "Richard suspects I've turned against him. He made a veiled threat today about heart conditions being so unpredictable. I've moved everything to the attic box and told Morgan it contains important insurance documents. If anything happens to me, I pray she finds it. Richard, if you're reading this instead, know that I've arranged for backups to be delivered to the authorities if I die under suspicious circumstances. You've won this round, but you won't win the war. Newspaper clippings at the bottom of the box filled in the remaining blanks. My grandfather hadn't owned just a small pharmacy, he had founded Wells Pharmaceutical, a company that developed a breakthrough cancer treatment in the 1970s. When rare but serious side effects emerged, he had personally pushed for a generous settlement with affected families, against the advice of his board. Among those families was Richard's. His father had apparently been a major investor who lost everything in the fallout. But the company itself hadn't failed. My grandfather had restructured, created new entities, and eventually sold the patents for hundreds of millions. My mother, who had publicly feuded with him over his business ethics, had been cut out of his will, or so she believed. According to the final document in the box, a copy of a trust agreement, my grandfather had actually placed her inheritance in a blind trust, to be revealed to her on her 50th birthday. She had died at 49, never knowing the truth. The sick realization dawned on me: Richard had married me to find hidden assets that likely no longer existed, while my mother had initially facilitated the relationship out of misplaced vengeance, only to regret her actions too late. My entire marriage had been a con, my children pawns in a decades-old vendetta, and my current nightmare orchestrated from the beginning. But in this dusty envelope, I now held the key to fighting back. Dawn was breaking as I finally closed the box, my mind racing with possibilities. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I reached for my phone and called Grace. "I need to see you immediately," I said when she answered, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "I've found something that changes everything." Grace's office was barely open when I arrived, clutching the box from my mother's attic. Her secretary hadn't even switched on all the lights yet, but Grace was waiting, concern etched on her face. "You sounded different on the phone," she said, gesturing me into her office. "What's happened?" I placed the box on her desk. My entire marriage was a fraud. Richard targeted me specifically as part of a revenge plot involving my family. And I have proof. Over the next hour, I laid out the evidence: the photos, letters, recordings, and my mother's journal. Grace's expression shifted from skepticism to shock to calculated interest. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "And potentially game-changing. But Morgan, we need to be methodical. Richard has proven he's always several steps ahead. If we move on this without the right strategy, he could destroy this evidence or claim it's fabricated. So what do we do?" I asked, the initial surge of excitement giving way to caution. "First, we secure everything. I'm making digital copies of all of this right now." She began scanning documents and copying files. "Second, we need independent verification of as much as possible. And third, we need more. These revelations give us a new lens to investigate Richard, but they're just the starting point." Within hours, Grace had brought in Melissa Parker, a former FBI agent turned private investigator who specialized in financial fraud. "Quite the rabbit hole you've uncovered," Melissa said after reviewing the materials. Her no-nonsense demeanor was reassuring. Here was someone who wouldn't be easily intimidated by Richard's resources. "Your mother was smart to keep these records, but they're fragmentary. We need to build a complete picture." We established a secure office in the back room of Grace's practice, with dedicated computers not connected to the firm's network. The walls soon filled with timelines, photographs, and flowcharts mapping Richard's various enterprises and connections. Each day brought new revelations about the man I thought I had known. Our first major breakthrough came when Melissa located James Whitfield, the man from the recordings. A financial advisor with a checkered history, James had worked with Richard on several ventures of questionable legality. More importantly, he had recently fallen out with Richard over a deal gone wrong. "He's vulnerable and angry," Melissa reported. "With the right pressure, he might flip." It took 2 weeks of surveillance and careful approach before James agreed to meet, not out of conscience, but self-preservation. "Richard would bury me if he knew I was talking to you," he said, nervously scanning the private room in the anonymous diner Melissa had chosen for their meeting. But he's already setting me up to take the fall for the Cayman transfers. I need insurance. The Cayman transfers turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. James provided documentation of offshore accounts, shell companies, and a complex web of financial maneuvers designed to hide assets, evade taxes, and launder money from less than legitimate business dealings. Richard calls it his rainy day system, James explained. Multiple accounts, multiple jurisdictions, all interconnected but with plausible deniability built in. Your family assets were just one target among many. More disturbingly, James confirmed that Brooke wasn't just Richard's mistress, she was a willing accomplice in his schemes, with her own financial stake in the outcome. She handles the physical documentation, sets up the meetings, provides alibis when needed. Richard calls her his cleaner. She's been with him longer than you realize, at least a year before he filed for divorce. Armed with James's information, Melissa began tracking financial flows, while Grace focused on building the legal case. I threw myself into analyzing Richard's past business deals, using my legal training to spot patterns and connections we might otherwise miss. Our next priority was finding Angela, the housekeeper who had tried to warn me. Melissa eventually located her in Arizona, staying with her sister. After assurances of protection for her family, Angela agreed to provide a sworn statement about Richard's instructions to lie in her testimony. He told me what to say, word for word, Angela revealed during our video call. Made me practice until it sounded natural. Said if I didn't do exactly as he asked, my sister would be deported, and I would be charged with theft. He even planted a necklace of Mrs. Blackwell's in my things as insurance. The pieces were falling into place, but we still needed to understand the full scope of Richard's plan. Grace suggested reaching out to Veronica Winters, not just Judge Winters' daughter, but Richard's ex-girlfriend from before he met me. It's risky, Grace acknowledged. She could alert her father or Richard. But if she had a similar experience? The gamble paid off. Veronica, now living in Seattle and estranged from her father, had her own story of manipulation and gaslighting at Richard's hands. He isolated me, made me doubt my own perceptions, then discarded me when I was no longer useful to his ambitions, she said during our confidential Zoom call. When I tried to warn people about him, my father called me unstable and threatened to have me committed. Now I understand why. Richard had already started cultivating him as an asset. With Melissa's financial tracking, we uncovered a complex system of payments from one of Richard's shell companies to entities connected to Judge Winters. Not direct bribes, but consulting fees and investment opportunities that had enriched the judge by hundreds of thousands of dollars. We also discovered Richard's pattern extended beyond me. He had systematically targeted other individuals with potential access to significant assets, cultivated relationships with them, then engineered conflicts that allowed him to seize control. The psychological warfare he had waged against me was a refined version of tactics he had used before. Dr. Lydia Henderson, the court-appointed psychologist who had evaluated me, was next on our list. Melissa's investigation revealed unusual deposits into her accounts coinciding with my case. When confronted with this evidence and the possibility of losing her license, Dr. Henderson reluctantly admitted to slanting her evaluation under pressure from Richard. He had information about an ethical violation in my past, a boundary crossing with a former patient that could have ended my career, she confessed. I convinced myself I was just emphasizing certain aspects of your profile, not fabricating them entirely. I've regretted it every day since. While our investigation expanded, I maintained my supervised visitation with Emma and Nathan, careful not to give any indication that circumstances might change. This became increasingly difficult as they repeated things Richard and Brooke had told them, that I was unstable, that I didn't really want to be their mother, that I was selfishly fighting the divorce out of spite. Dad says we might move to Switzerland permanently next year, Emma mentioned during one visit, studying my face for reaction. He says you won't be able to bother us there. I maintained my composure, engaging them in conversation about school and activities while inwardly seething at Richard's continued manipulation. Each visit strengthened my resolve to see this through, not just for my sake but for theirs. By the 2-month mark of our investigation, we had accumulated a formidable arsenal. Financial records demonstrating fraud, witness testimony about manipulation and perjury, evidence of judicial tampering, and the original documents from my mother's attic providing the motive for the entire scheme. "We're almost ready," Grace announced during our daily strategy session. "But we need to anticipate Richard's counterattacks. He won't go down without a fight, and he still has resources we don't know about." "What about Richard's father?" I suggested. "In the recordings, he mentioned avenging his father's losses from my grandfather's company. If his father is still alive, he might be involved in this too." Melissa's research revealed that Preston Blackwell, supposedly deceased according to Richard's stories about being orphaned young, was very much alive and living in a luxury retirement community in Florida. A quick deep dive into his finances showed regular payments from one of Richard's shell companies. "Should we approach him?" I asked. Grace shook her head. "Too risky. He's likely loyal to Richard and would warn him immediately. But his existence is another piece of evidence that Richard has systematically lied about fundamental aspects of his life." Our final preparation involved mapping every possible legal counter-strategy Richard might employ, from claiming the evidence was fabricated to filing for immediate relocation with the children. Grace prepared motions addressing each scenario, while Melissa ensured all our evidence was securely backed up in multiple locations. "There's one more thing we should consider," I said during our final planning session. "Richard doesn't just want to win, he wants to destroy me completely. When we move, he'll come after us with everything he has. We need to be prepared for tactics we haven't even imagined." Grace nodded grimly. "That's why we're not just filing motions to reopen the custody and asset division. We're simultaneously submitting evidence to the district attorney, the State Bar Ethics Committee, and the Judicial Conduct Commission. Multiple fronts, coordinated timing. When we move decisively." On the eve of filing our motions, I sat alone in my apartment, reviewing our strategy one last time. On my phone was a photo of Emma and Nathan from our last visitation. Next to it, I placed the picture of Richard with my mother from all those years ago, the first piece in unraveling his elaborate deception. "Tomorrow," I whispered to their images, "everything changes." The courtroom hushed as I entered with Grace, followed by Melissa and our legal team. We had deliberately arrived last, just before the scheduled hearing time. Richard sat at the defendant's table with his attorneys, his posture relaxed, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Brooke was conspicuously absent, a detail that didn't escape my notice. Judge Winters frowned as he took in our expanded legal presence. "Ms. Sullivan, this hearing was scheduled specifically to address your client's failure to comply with the psychological evaluation requirements. I don't see the need for this, entourage." Grace stepped forward. "Your Honor, we filed several emergency motions this morning that substantially change the nature of today's proceedings. We're prepared to present evidence of extensive fraud upon this court, including witness tampering, fabricated evidence, and judicial misconduct." The smirk vanished from Richard's face. He leaned forward to whisper urgently to his lead attorney, Matthew Pearson, whose expression remained carefully neutral. Judge Winters' face flushed. "Those are serious allegations, Counselor. I sincerely hope you can substantiate them." "We can, Your Honor," Grace replied, her voice steady. "We've also filed complaints with the District Attorney's Office and the Judicial Conduct Commission, with copies of all evidence provided to both. Given the nature of our allegations, which directly involve Your Honor, we respectfully request that you recuse yourself immediately and allow another judge to evaluate our motions." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard was now in intense discussion with his legal team, his composed facade cracking visibly. Judge Winters appeared momentarily stunned before bringing his gavel down sharply. "Silence. Miss Sullivan, approach the bench. Mr. Pearson, you as well." While the attorneys conferred in hushed tones at the bench, I maintained my focus straight ahead, refusing to meet Richard's gaze despite feeling it boring into me. This moment, seeing him realize he wasn't in control, was one I had visualized for months. After several tense minutes, Judge Winters cleared his throat. In light of the unusual circumstances, I am temporarily recusing myself pending review of these allegations. This hearing will be continued before Judge Marilyn Chen tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Court is adjourned. As we gathered our materials to leave, Richard finally caught my eye. The hatred in his expression would have terrified me months ago. Now, I met his gaze steadily until he looked away. Phase 1 complete, Grace murmured as we exited the courtroom. Be prepared for counterattacks. Richard won't take this lying down. She was right. Within hours, Richard's team filed emergency motions alleging I had fabricated evidence and was experiencing a dangerous psychological break. They attempted to secure an emergency order barring me from any contact with the children and sought permission to relocate them immediately for their safety. Thanks to our preparation, we had anticipated these moves. Judge Chen, known for her methodical approach and intolerance for legal gamesmanship, denied the emergency requests and ordered a full evidentiary hearing. Let them present their actual evidence, she stated in her ruling. Allegations alone are insufficient for such extreme measures. The following morning, the real battle began. The courtroom was packed. News of the sensational allegations had spread quickly through legal circles. Judge Chen, a petite woman with penetrating eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, called the court to order promptly at 9 a.m. Before we begin, she announced, I've reviewed the filings from both parties. This is an unusual situation, to say the least. I intend to evaluate the evidence methodically, without presumption either way. Ms. Sullivan, as the moving party, you may proceed first. Grace began with the contents of the envelope, the photos, letters, and recordings that established Richard's long-term deception. Richard's attorneys objected vigorously, claiming the materials couldn't be authenticated and were likely fabricated. Your Honor, we anticipated this objection, Grace responded. We have submitted these materials to forensic analysis, confirming the age of the paper, ink, and recording device. More importantly, we have independent verification of the scheme described in these documents. She called our first witness, James Whitfield. As James described his years of collaboration with Richard, the financial machinations, and the specific targeting of me and my family, Richard's expression darkened. His attorneys passed him increasingly urgent notes, which he barely glanced at. And would you recognize the voice on this recording? Grace asked, cueing a section of the tape from my mother's attic. James nodded. That's Richard Blackwell and myself, discussing the plan to use Morgan to access her family's hidden assets. Richard's attorney jumped up. Objection. There's no chain of custody for this alleged recording. It could have been manufactured recently. Your Honor, Grace countered, we have submitted expert analysis dating the recording device and magnetic tape to approximately 15 years ago. Additionally, Mr. Whitfield has provided his own contemporaneous notes that corroborate the content. Judge Chen allowed the evidence, noting the objection for the record. Next came financial evidence. Melissa Parker methodically walked the court through Richard's web of fraudulent transactions, offshore accounts, and hidden assets. Based on my analysis, she concluded, Mr. Blackwell has concealed approximately $22 million from this court during the divorce proceedings, including funds directly traceable to joint marital assets that were systematically diverted beginning approximately 18 months before he filed for divorce. Richard's legal team fought each piece of evidence, but their efforts seemed increasingly desperate as the morning wore on. During a brief recess, I overheard one of his attorneys urging him to consider settlement negotiations, advice he vehemently rejected. After lunch, we presented evidence of witness tampering. Angela Ramirez testified via video link, visibly nervous but resolute as she described how Richard had coerced her false testimony against me. He told me exactly what to say, she explained. That Mrs. Wells was drinking heavily, that she yelled at the children, that she neglected them. None of it was true. I worked in that house for 7 years, and she was always a good mother. And why did you provide this false testimony? Grace asked gently. Angela's eyes filled with tears. He threatened my sister's immigration status. He said he had friends who could have her deported within days, and that I would be arrested for theft. He planted Mrs. Wells' jewelry in my belongings to make the threat credible. Richard's attorneys attempted to paint Angela as disgruntled and unreliable, but her straightforward answers and clear distress made her a compelling witness. The most damaging testimony came from Dr. Lydia Henderson, the court-appointed psychologist. Her admission that she had deliberately distorted my evaluation under pressure from Richard, including specific details she had been instructed to emphasize, visibly shocked Judge Chen. "I violated every ethical principle of my profession," Dr. Henderson confessed, her voice thick with shame. "Mr. Blackwell had evidence of a past ethical lapse that could have ended my career. I convinced myself I was just emphasizing certain aspects, but in reality, I completely misrepresented Ms. Wells' psychological state." By mid-afternoon, the momentum had shifted decisively. Richard was in constant, agitated conversation with his legal team. When court resumed after another brief recess, Matthew Pearson stood. "Your Honor, in light of the unexpected testimony today, we request a continuance to properly address these allegations." Judge Chen's expression was stern. "Mr. Pearson, your client has had ample opportunity to respond to each witness. A continuance appears designed merely to delay proceedings. Request denied." The final blow came when we presented evidence of improper influence over Judge Winters, financial records showing substantial indirect payments from Richard's companies to the judge's family members and private accounts. As this evidence was being presented, a commotion arose at the back of the courtroom. Richard, seeing the inevitable outcome, had attempted to leave. Court officers intercepted him at the doors. "Mr. Blackwell, return to your seat immediately," Judge Chen ordered, her voice like steel. "This court has not adjourned." Richard's face was ashen as he was escorted back to the defense table. His attorneys looked equally grim, now physically distancing themselves from their client. In the end, Judge Chen's ruling was comprehensive and unequivocal. She vacated all previous orders regarding custody and asset division, citing clear and convincing evidence of fraud upon the court. She granted me immediate temporary full custody of Emma and Nathan, with Richard limited to supervised visitation pending criminal investigation. All marital assets were frozen, with receivers appointed to identify and secure funds Richard had attempted to hide. Furthermore, Judge Chen concluded, this court is referring this matter to the district attorney for potential criminal charges including perjury, witness tampering, and financial fraud. Mr. Blackwell is ordered to surrender his passport immediately and remain within the jurisdiction pending those investigations. As the gavel fell, the courtroom erupted. Richard sat motionless, staring blankly ahead as his carefully constructed world collapsed around him. I felt no triumph, only profound relief tinged with sadness for the years of manipulation and the damage done to my children. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, alerted to the sensational developments. Grace fielded their questions with practiced discretion while I prepared for the most important moment, reuniting with my children. "Remember," she advised as we walked to her car, "this is just the beginning of recovery. The children have been influenced by Richard for months. It will take time to rebuild trust." I nodded, my mind already racing ahead to how I would explain everything to Emma and Nathan in age-appropriate ways. As we drove toward the Family Services Center where they were waiting, I realized the envelope hadn't just saved my legal case, it had given me the opportunity to save my children from growing up with Richard's influence. That was the true victory. The small apartment I had called home for the past months suddenly seemed both inadequate and perfect for welcoming my children back. I spent the morning before their arrival in a flurry of preparation, making up their beds with fresh linens, stocking the refrigerator with their favorite foods, arranging familiar photographs on the walls. A social worker would bring them directly from school, a transition plan designed to minimize trauma. Judge Chen had ordered a therapist to be present for this initial reunion, recognizing the complexity of the situation for Emma and Nathan. When the doorbell rang at 3:30 p.m., my heart nearly stopped. I took a deep breath, smoothed my shirt, and opened the door. Emma stood slightly behind the social worker, her posture rigid, eyes wary. Nathan clutched his backpack to his chest like a shield. Both looked as if they were visiting a stranger, not returning to their mother. "Hi," I said softly, fighting back tears. "I'm so happy to see you both." Nathan took a half-step forward before hesitating. Emma remained motionless, her expression guarded. Dr. Miller, the family therapist, gently guided us all inside. "Emma, Nathan, remember what we talked about? This is a time for everyone to adjust and reconnect. There are no right or wrong feelings here." The first hours were achingly awkward. We sat in the living room, the children perched on the edge of the sofa as if ready to flee at any moment. Dr. Miller facilitated conversation, asking neutral questions about school and activities. Nathan occasionally offered one-word answers. Emma remained largely silent, studying me with conflicted eyes. "Where's Dad?" Nathan finally asked, the question I'd been dreading. I chose my words carefully. "Your dad is staying at a different place right now. There have been some changes in the court's decisions about our family. I know this is confusing and probably scary." "Dad said you're sick and make up stories," Emma blurted out, her first real contribution to the conversation. "He said you're jealous of Brooke and want to hurt him." The accusation stung, but Dr. Miller had prepared me for exactly this scenario. "I understand that's what you've been told," I replied evenly. "The truth is complicated, and we'll talk about it more as you feel ready. What's most important is that I love you both very much, and I've missed you every single day." That first evening set the pattern for our initial days together. The children were polite but distant, checking the clock frequently, retreating to their rooms at the earliest opportunity. They spoke to each other in whispers and went silent when I entered a room. Nathan was the first to show cracks in his reserve. On the third night, he appeared at my bedroom door around midnight, eyes wide and tearful. "I had a bad dream," he admitted, his voice small. I patted the bed beside me. "Want to talk about it?" He climbed up, keeping a careful distance between us. "Dad was yelling at everyone. He said you tricked the judges and police, and he was going to fix it." My chest tightened. "That sounds scary." Nathan nodded, then asked the question that had clearly been troubling him: "Is Dad going to jail? How do you explain potential criminal proceedings to a 9-year-old? I opted for honesty without overwhelming detail. "There are some serious problems with things Dad did. The courts are figuring it all out. Whatever happens, it's not your fault or your responsibility." He inched closer. "Dad said if I was good and said the right things, we could stay together. But I didn't know what the right things were sometimes." His voice broke. I didn't want to make him mad. The revelation of this emotional manipulation broke my heart. I opened my arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Nathan leaned into them. "You don't ever have to worry about saying the right things with me," I promised. "You just need to be honest about how you feel." That small breakthrough with Nathan represented one step forward in a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. The following day, Emma refused to join us for dinner, claiming homework demands. When I checked on her later, I found her sobbing quietly into her pillow. "I don't know who's telling the truth," she admitted when I sat beside her. "Dad says you're lying." "You say he lied. How am I supposed to know?" It was a devastatingly mature question from a 12-year-old. "That's an incredibly fair question," I acknowledged. "And I don't expect you to just take my word for it. Trust has to be earned back. I'm willing to give you the time and space you need." 2 weeks into our reunion, we received clearance to return to our Westchester home. The court had granted me exclusive use of the property pending final asset division, with Richard's access restricted. I offered the children a choice: remain in the apartment or return to the house they'd grown up in. To my surprise, both chose to stay in the apartment temporarily. "The house is where Dad and Brooke were," Emma explained, the first time she'd voluntarily shared her feelings. "It feels weird to go back without them, but also weird to go back with you." Her honesty, though painful, was progress. We began family therapy sessions 3 times weekly, supplemented by individual therapy for each of us. Slowly, patterns emerged in the children's disclosures, Richard's subtle coaching about what to tell evaluators, his strategic comments undermining their trust in me, his promises of rewards for loyalty to him. He said if I told the judge I wanted to live with him, we could move to Switzerland and I could attend a special music academy, Emma revealed in a joint session. But when I asked about details, he'd get angry and say I was ungrateful. Nathan's experiences had been similar. Dad said you didn't really want to be at my soccer games, that you only came because you had to pretend to be interested. His eyes sought mine. But you knew all my teammates' names. You even knew which position everyone played. These small recognitions of manipulation represented critical turning points in our healing process. For weeks after our reunion, we finally visited the Westchester house together. I had arranged for all of Richard's and Brooke's belongings to be packed and removed beforehand, eliminating visible reminders of their presence. Standing in the grand foyer where Richard had first handed me divorce papers felt surreal. The children moved through the spaces cautiously, as if expecting to find things dramatically changed. My trophies are all gone, Nathan noted, staring at empty shelves in his room. Dad took them to the new apartment, Emma explained. He said they were his because he paid for the soccer league. Such petty cruelty was revealing itself in countless ways. Richard had systematically removed anything that held sentimental value for the children, apparently intent on forcing them to choose between their possessions and their mother. We can get new trophies, I assured Nathan. The achievements are yours, no matter where the physical awards are. Over the following weeks, we gradually reclaimed our home, redecorating rooms to remove painful associations, donating furniture with too many difficult memories attached, creating new spaces that reflected our changing family identity. Emma initially refused to play her violin, the instrument too closely associated with Richard's manipulations. Instead, she discovered an interest in digital music composition, something entirely her own. Nathan's soccer passion remained but evolved as he joined a new league with no connections to Richard. Midway through summer, we adopted a rescue dog, a gentle, one-eyed mutt we named Justice. His uncomplicated love and loyalty provided comfort on difficult days when court proceedings or new revelations reopened wounds. Richard's attempts to reconnect with the children were sporadic and ultimately self-sabotaging. During his first supervised visitation, he spent most of the time disparaging me and the court system rather than engaging with Emma and Nathan. The supervisor ended the visit early, and Richard's subsequent visitation rights were further restricted. As summer turned to fall, we established new routines and traditions. Sunday morning pancake breakfasts. Wednesday movie nights. Impromptu dance parties in the kitchen. Each new memory helped overwrite the painful ones. In the evenings, I began cooking from my mother's old recipe book, dishes from my childhood that connected Emma and Nathan to the grandmother they'd known too briefly. As we ate her famous pot roast one night, I shared age-appropriate versions of what I'd discovered about her complicated role in our family story. Grandma made a big mistake because she was hurt and angry, I explained. But she tried to fix it when she realized how wrong she'd been. Sometimes the bravest thing is admitting when you've made a terrible mistake. Like Dad should do? Nathan asked, perceptive as always. Yes, I agreed. Like Dad should do. Emma pushed her food around her plate. Do you think he ever will? I met her eyes honestly. I don't know, sweetheart. Some people find it very hard to admit when they're wrong. If he did, she asked carefully, would you forgive him? The question caught me off guard. I considered it seriously before answering. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or allowing someone to hurt you again. It means not letting anger control your life anymore. I'm working on that kind of forgiveness, for all our sakes. Emma nodded thoughtfully. Later that evening, she took her violin from its case for the first time since returning home. The haunting notes of Bach filled our home as Emma played, rusty at first, then with growing confidence. Nathan sat beside me on the stairs as we listened, his small hand finding mine in the semi-darkness. We're going to be okay, aren't we? He whispered. I squeezed his hand gently. Yes, I promised. We already are. 1 year after finding the envelope that changed everything, I sat on the back porch of our home, watching Emma and Nathan play fetch with Justice in the yard. The autumn leaves created a golden canopy above them, sunlight filtering through in dappled patterns. Their laughter, free, uninhibited, and increasingly frequent, was the soundtrack of our healing. Richard's legal fate had finally been settled after months of proceedings. He had ultimately accepted a plea deal on multiple fraud charges rather than face a public trial where all his manipulations would be exposed. The 5-year prison sentence was accompanied by substantial financial penalties and restitution requirements. More importantly to me, he had relinquished all parental rights in exchange for avoiding additional charges related to child manipulation and witness tampering. The decision had been his own, a final act of self-interest masked as consideration, as he claimed he didn't want to put the children through more trauma. In reality, his control over them had slipped away as therapy helped them recognize and process his manipulation. The divorce was finalized with a complete reversal of the initial judgment. All marital assets were properly divided, with additional compensation for Richard's fraudulent actions. More than the financial vindication, I valued the court's formal acknowledgement of the psychological damage his schemes had caused. My relationship with wealth had fundamentally changed through this experience. The mansion I had once prized now felt valuable primarily as a stable home for my children, not as a status symbol. I had established a foundation to provide legal assistance to parents facing similar situations of deception and manipulation in family court, using a portion of the recovered assets to fund its operations. Emma had thrived once freed from Richard's calculated pressure. Her music evolved from a performance demanded by a controlling father to a genuine form of self-expression. She had recently been selected for a prestigious youth orchestra, an achievement she celebrated by playing her violin for hours afterward, simply for the joy of it. Nathan's recovery had manifested differently. Initially fearful of making decisions after years of Richard's subtle control, he gradually reclaimed his autonomy through small choices that built his confidence. His soccer coach noted his transformation from a technically skilled but hesitant player to one who took initiative and demonstrated leadership on the field. Both children still attended therapy, though less frequently. The therapist had helped us develop a shared vocabulary for discussing difficult emotions and establishing healthy boundaries. Emma no longer felt responsible for managing my feelings, and Nathan had stopped seeking constant approval for normal childhood behaviors. I had made my own strides toward healing. Returning to legal practice had restored my professional identity, but with a meaningful shift in focus. I now specialized in cases involving financial fraud and divorce proceedings, using my personal experience and legal training to help others navigate similar situations. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply fulfilling. Unexpected romance had entered my life through David Chen, a widowed father from the children's school. Our friendship had evolved naturally from school committee meetings to coffee discussions to family outings. His gentle understanding of trauma and patience with my trust issues made him uniquely equipped to navigate my complicated healing process. The children appreciated his kindness without feeling he was attempting to replace their father, a distinction they articulated with surprising clarity. The dusty envelope that had initiated our transformation now resided in a frame in my home office. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how truth, however painful, ultimately creates the possibility for authentic healing. My mother's final act of protection had required courage I hoped to emulate. "Mom! Come look!" Nathan called from the yard, interrupting my reflection. He and Emma had constructed an elaborate obstacle course for Justice, who pranced through it with comical determination. Joining them on the lawn, I marveled at how far we had come. The painful lessons of the past 2 years had taught me to trust my instincts, document everything, and recognize that sometimes losing everything is the only pathway to discovering what truly matters. That evening, as we prepared for our first real family vacation since the ordeal, a simple beach trip rather than the extravagant European tours Richard had preferred, Emma asked the question that revealed how deeply she had processed our family's journey. "Do you think Grandma knew what would happen when she put those things in the attic?" I considered this as I folded summer clothes into a suitcase. "I think she hoped I would never need to find them." But she made sure they were there if I did. Emma nodded thoughtfully. Like an escape hatch in case of emergency. Exactly like that, I agreed. She couldn't undo her mistakes, but she could give me the tools to protect myself when the consequences arrived. Later, tucking Nathan into bed, I found him organizing his vacation packing with unusual care. I'm bringing Dad's picture, he said cautiously, showing me a small framed photo. Not because I miss how things were, but because Dr. Miller says it's okay to remember the good parts while understanding the whole truth. The wisdom in his 9-year-old perspective brought tears to my eyes. That's exactly right, I told him. The complicated truth is always better than a comfortable lie. As I finished my own packing that night, I reflected on the dusty envelope that had led us here. It hadn't just exposed Richard's deception, it had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own life choices, my willingness to ignore warning signs, and the false security I had found in material success. The hardest lesson had been accepting that justice doesn't erase pain, it simply creates space for healing to begin. The envelope hadn't magically restored my family or erased the trauma. It had merely opened the door to a difficult but necessary journey of rebuilding with truth as our foundation. Tomorrow we would leave for our vacation, a new family configuration finding its way forward. Different from what I had once envisioned, but authentic in a way my marriage to Richard had never been. The children were healing. I was healing. And the dusty envelope that had catalyzed our transformation now served as a reminder that truth, however long buried, eventually finds its way to light. Have you ever discovered something unexpected that completely changed your perspective on a relationship or situation in your life? Drop a comment below sharing your experience with life-changing revelations. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience and redemption. Don't forget to share with someone who might need encouragement that even in our darkest moments, the truth can ultimately set us free. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey, and remember, sometimes what seems like the end is actually just the beginning of something much better. Riffing.